Okay, well, welcome everybody here. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for, yes, Kate? Yes. Can you do it on your computer? Thank you so much. I love teamwork. It makes the dream work. So thank you. Yes. I'm just gonna go off. Is this better? I don't have that many options. Hi. So thank you everybody for joining us this evening for the winter edition of the Barker Seasonal Forum, which we've started last fall or end of last summer, and it's a reoccurring both community meeting and gathering space here at the Barker House that really uplifts Save the Dunes mission through advocacy, conservation, community engagement, and history, because Save the Dunes has a very long and wonderful history. So tonight we have Serena Ard from the Westchester History Museum joining us virtually, giving us a presentation on the early history. So we will be starting that now.
Okay, thank you. I do want to apologize for not being there in person, but if you've ever heard me speak before, you know that my voice is actually not usually this low. So my allergies have just gone haywire with all this crazy weather. So I was asked to do this program. I've actually done a program like this many, many, many times, but I've added some stuff at the end specifically about Save the Dunes Council for obvious reasons. But a lot of people don't understand the history behind how the state and national parks were actually created. And when I started this job at the History Museum 12 years ago, I discovered pretty quickly that the history of the dunes and the history of the parks were some of the most important and the most called for topics in research. So I quickly made it, part of my job to understand how the who, what, when, where, how, and why of it all. And to give you a little bit of background about myself, I grew up in Lake County in Dyer, Indiana. I went to Lake Central High School. When I went to college in Texas, and I actually taught middle school and high school for about 8 years total. If you know any teachers, they might do the same thing. I have a tendency to really talk with my hands a lot. So I'll apologize ahead of time if it gets distracting, if you can see me. But it actually lent itself very well to do these kind of programs for people. So if you have any questions while I talk, feel free to put it in the chat if you're on Zoom, or write it down, because if you're like me, you forget about it. If it's halfway in, then by the end, when I ask for questions, you won't remember what you wanted to ask. So to really talk, oh, I also want to apologize. I'll probably be drinking some water in the middle just because everything is not right in my head right now. So in order to really talk about the Indiana dunes and the conservation of the dunes, you really have to look for first at how the United States got involved in this concept of conservation. What made it so important? When I taught high school, I taught American literature. And one of the things we taught was American Romanticism. And in the 1830s, you started to see this trend toward an appreciation for nature as industry was starting to rise. People wanted to go out to the country and enjoy the country much more. By the end of the 1800s, you start seeing, one, we had Yellowstone established as the first national park, the creation of the Sierra Club in 1892, and then with the rise of Teddy Roosevelt as president in 1901, you start seeing this push for land conservation. Now, land conservation in 1901 was very different from land conservation today, in part because our understanding of science and the environment are just vastly different. But with this mindset in mind, with this culture and these ideas in mind, things started to happen in the early 1800s and the late 1800s, early 1900s. Why aren't you advancing? There we go. So the beginning of conservation efforts in the Indiana Dunes starts in Chicago. And as a native of Northwest Indiana, it kind of pains me to say that it starts in Chicago, but it does. And we really actually have a lot to be thankful for to Chicago residents for helping to save the Indiana Dunes. But the Prairie Club was really involved in that early movement, and it got started because of, first and foremost, the Chicago Playground Association. By the late 1800s, early 1900s, cities had no good space for children to play. Children were playing in garbage-strewn alleys. This is a picture of Chicago's near West Side, and they didn't have really like sewage systems. So, I mean, people threw their garbage into the alleyway, and that was just typical. But the kids had nowhere to play except these alleyways. So they're playing in all this filth. And people started realizing that this was a very bad situation. So they organized the Chicago Playground Association. It was the Chicago branch of a nationwide organization that fought for the establishment of playgrounds that would provide physical, emotional, and intellectual support for urban children who had very limited space to roam and play. In Chicago, it was really inspired by the settlement house movement and the Jane Addams Hull House in Chicago. The Chicago Playground Association was established in 1904, and it was made up of members from who are already part of 15 different artistic, civic, and intellectual organizations. Their goal was to provide places for outdoor recreation. Okay, so they formed in 1908. By 1904, that goal was actually met. In 1908, Chicago established a bond issue for construction and improvement of public playgrounds, with more parks added in certain areas of the city. So with their goals largely met, they realized they had to develop a new purpose. So their new purpose was to get adults outside. They managed to get children outside and in fresh, grass and trees and all that. But they realized that adults really needed to have that too. They needed to be able to go into nature, get out of the city, get out of the, work, and appreciate and learn about nature. So in April of 1908, the Saturday afternoon walk started. The first committee members were included Dwight Perkins, who was an architect, Alexander Wilson, Henry Chandler Coles, Hamlin Garland, who was a novelist, and Jens Jensen, and Frank Dudley, the artist. Their first walk was to the Mount Forest district near Willow Springs in Illinois and had 128 people. And these walks were exactly what they sound like. It was a Saturday afternoon walk in a park somewhere. The group opened the walks to the entire public and encouraged all Chicago residents to benefit from outdoor exercise and introduced them to the beautiful natural resources of Chicago and the surrounding areas. The first walk in the dunes, excuse me, was also their first all-day outing. So previous outings were like maybe a mile hike or so. This was going to be an all-day trip because they had to take the train into the Indiana Dunes, then they had to do the hike, and then they still had to ride the train back. So that they knew it was going to be hours long. They were going to have lunch somewhere. So this was their first all-day outing on May 30th, 1908. 338 people attended this first Saturday afternoon walk in the Indiana Dunes. And it was a hit. People loved it. They generally started with a train ride. And yes, they wore all the clothes that people in 1908 wore. So you see these ladies in their long skirts and high-necked blouses and long-sleeved blouses all the way to their wrists and their little hats. I really get irritated if I have to hike in the sand in tennis shoes because I get sand all in my shoes. I can't imagine having to hike also in a wool skirt and blouse. The men were in their suits, three-piece suits, shirt, vest, jacket, pants. I mean, it was a pretty high class hiking system here. But the only reason it was really available to them was because of the arrival of the railroads. With the building of the South Shore line, they were able to access the dunes many times over. But along that trip, whether it was the South Shore or the Michigan Central that they were taking, they were passing by the new city of Gary. And they were able to see the kind of destruction that was happening to the sand dunes along the way. And this, for some, was very concerning. They generally rode to the Indiana Dunes. As soon as the South Shore line came to Tremont, they stopped at Tremont and then hiked up into what is now the state park. This is just one of my favorite pictures of them in what is now the state park because it's just a weird picture. And this also goes to my statement that the understanding of land conservation back then is very different than it is now. The idea of having 400 people climbing up the same sand dune off of a trail is like stressful to some of us now, but back then they didn't necessarily understand the impact that they were having on the plants and the dune itself by having that many people all at once in the same place, trudging everywhere. And it gets worse, which we'll see here in a minute. But the walks usually started with the train ride, where everyone would meet to begin the walk. These were not pleasant strolls. You know what? I passed the picture that I wanted to show you, I think. No. Do I have it in here? I have this great picture of one of their early strolls where they're walking on this, I'll say, quote unquote, bridge. It's like slats of wood tied together with rope and 2 ropes on the side for people to balance on, right? And it's very narrow. The actual boards are as you walk. So the width of the board that you have to walk on is probably about 10 inches. And you have this woman walking in her skirt and blouse and hat, carrying her jacket over her arm with one hand on the rope on the right-hand side, and she's just strolling along very pleasantly. And behind her is a gentleman in his suit with his jacket on and his hat on, holding on to both sides of the rope for dear life. And I feel like that is that picture kind of really establishes this is what the Prairie Club did. They did not have pleasant strolls, down walkways. They really hiked. They really did a lot of work. There's another photo where they're climbing through barbed wire fences. And so the gentlemen are holding the barbed wire apart so that people can squeeze through and hopefully not get stuck on the barbed wire fence. It's kind of crazy if you ask me, but to each their own. So they did these very intensive walks, and the walk that they took in the dunes at Miller Beach was described as, quote, the walk through the wildest country in the vicinity of Chicago. So Chicagoans at the time really considered the Indiana Dunes to be this like wilderness, this just uninhabited wild country. Sometimes I wonder if they thought bears might be, attacking them in the woods or something. I don't know, but they always described it as very wild. And in the dunes at the time, there weren't actually, other than Gary and East Chicago, like that area, once you got into the Portage area and Porter County and LaPorte County, there wasn't, up to Michigan City, there wasn't a lot happening. There were some shacks in the dunes for people who lived on the dunes and kind of stayed away from people. We had some, Alice Gray lived in the dunes starting in 1915. Prior to her, there was George Blagg. He was called the Hermit of the Dunes. He was a Civil War veteran who moved into the dunes in like the 1870s, 1880s. And he lived in an abandoned shack that was already there. So it really was kind of a wilderness. You were going to go into the dunes, and once you walked away from the train station, there was nothing. You weren't going to come across anyone, most likely, on a solid 2 to 3 mile hike. You weren't going to cross traffic with anyone else. The walk organizers had to secure permission to walk on people's property and arrange meals. They provided information on the history of the region, as well as the plants, flowers, birds, and animals that they might see. These walks continued just like this for about 2 years, with new walks being previewed and added to the roster. By 1909, this is just 1 year after the Saturday afternoon walks started. By 1909, the mailing list included more than 4,000 names. But of those 4,000, only about a third had actually taken walks. Now, that's still pretty impressive. That's over 1,000 people in just 1 year who were taking part in these Saturday afternoon walks. No walks were ever scheduled over the summer months when walkers might have other vacation plans. And the last walk was usually scheduled for the 4th of July. By the end of 1910, the group had done 87 or 86 afternoon walks and 12 all-day walks, including in the winter. This picture shows the shelf ice in the Indiana Dunes. In the background, you can see the Prairie Club Beach House, which is in today's Indiana Dunes State Park. They hiked here all the time in December, in January, in 10-degree weather, in 30-degree weather like today. We do have a couple of concerning photographs of people walking on the shelf ice, because apparently they did not comprehend how dangerous shelf ice can be. But they came all the time. They loved the Indiana Dunes. In 1911, they wanted to establish a more formal organization in order to better organize the mailings and the lists and the walks. And so they actually incorporated as the Prairie Club. The name for the Prairie Club was suggested by Jens Jensen, who was a landscape architect. And he got the inspiration for the name from the nickname for Illinois, which is the Prairie State. When the Prairie Club incorporated, they had 102 charter members and 321 associate members, all of whom joined with an initiation fee of $2. Annual membership was $1, but was not necessary in order to participate in the walks. They continued to keep all of the walks open and available to the entire public. But with your membership, you were able to get your Prairie Club bulletin, which explained what events were coming up, and news of the club and things like that. The Saturday walks continued with the Prairie Club. They added Sunday walks, and they added new destinations to Wisconsin and Indiana, as well as throughout Illinois. They also started doing long trips to like Glacier National Park and Colorado Rockies and Canada. They also started special interest groups. Those special interest groups included the Camera Club. And the Camera Club is one of the reasons why we have such a great archive of Prairie Club photographs, because they had photo contests every year. So people would turn in their best photo taken on a Prairie Club hike, and they would tell where it was taken, when it was taken. And we have, I want to say about 15 or 20 albums of photographs from the Prairie Club, in addition to all the loose photographs that we have. But one of my favorite parts about their photographs is it gives us a look at the areas that are now in the national park that have changed so much over time. So in the left-hand picture, you see in the background is the Shellberg farmhouse. They obviously got permission to visit the Shellberg farm and to be on their property. You also had what they called, this is how they labeled this picture in their album. They called it a haunted house in Furnaceville, which I have this great story of a haunted house in Furnaceville for another time, because I'll get off on, yeah. But hauntings in this area the stories of them are kind of hilarious. But they visited places that we know today very fondly as parts of the national and state park. And their photographs give us such a great historic look at how things used to look. Some of the problem is that if the photos aren't identified as a very specific place, I honestly couldn't tell you where in the dunes they are, because 100 years later, they're going to look very different, no matter what they did. They also had the Conservation Club. The Conservation Club started in 1913 by Jens Jensen. The purpose was to help make sure that whatever the Prairie Club brought into a property, they took back with them, that they took care on their hikes and walks, that they were able to save unique and valuable resources, plants and animals, and that they were eventually lobbying for the safety of the dunes from industrial exploitation. They also were active in the creation of the Cook County Forest Preserves. So, yeah. One of the things that the Prairie Club's most known for around here is their beach house, in part because the state park has the beach house blowout, which is named after the Prairie Club beach house. But before they built a very nice beach house, if you ask me, they used this abandoned shack, excuse me, that they borrowed from a Mr. Link. They first had to make a few repairs to make it functional. They cleared out a spring to make a fresh water supply. They added mosquito nettings to all the windows. They added boxes and nailed them to the walls to use as cupboards and lockers. They built a stove from bricks with a sheet of iron on top. They had a dining table, which you see on the picture on the right, was made from a door that had washed ashore. And they laid a trail to the beach, mostly on the beach already. And then they actually used this cabin as their beach house all summer long. And they had chaperones. So nobody in the club was allowed to use the beach house unless it was an organized club activity. So they had chaperones and rules. And their very first summer camp was 1912, and it was considered very successful. Every weekend from the 4th of July into September, they had 20 to 40 couples. For sleeping, nobody was allowed to sleep in the beach house because it wasn't that big. They all used tents. Some slept outside of a tent and just used a bedroll and only used the tent in rain. But in 1913, the group decided, we actually really like the dunes and we want to make this more official. So they raised $2,000 to build a beach house on a high dune overlooking the lake. They had it was about a mile and a half from the Tremont station. They leased the ground officially for 5 years with an option to renew. Their annual rent was $25, and it gave the club the use of the lakeshore and 2,500 acres of land, with the caveat that they did not damage trees or build fires in the woods. The house plans provided for a large central room with separate dorms for men and women, a front porch with a view of the lake. According to one child who was a kid in the Indiana Dunes when the Prairie Club was there, he said that no kids were ever allowed in the beach house. It was only adults who were allowed in the beach house. So if a kid was playing on the beach and they needed to drink water, you see those stairs in that left-hand picture? He claims that there was something like 200 stairs. That might have been a kid's like exaggerative mind. But he said in order to get a drink of fresh water, you had to walk all 200 stairs, go up, knock on the door, request a glass of water, wait for somebody to bring it to you, and then walk back down the 200 stairs. I'm not going to call him a liar. I imagine there probably were a lot of stairs. 200? I don't know. It could be. Anyway, the beach house was finished on October 19, 1913. Herb Reed's father and grandfather were actually part of the Prairie Club and helped build this house, the beach house. Ooh. Excuse me. And they celebrated the building of the beach house with a pageant, because that's what the Prairie Club did. I'm so sorry. Just got a tickle. Okay. Oh. So the beach house had very extensive rules that had to be followed in order to use the beach house. Ooh. Oh. But sorry. Between the beach house and the time that they spent in the dunes, they realized how problematic the situation was. As industries kept growing, as US Steel kept expanding, by the 1910s, Inland Steel had purchased more land along the dunes. Areas like today's Ogden Dunes and places like that. And they started realizing this is going to be a big problem. So different elements came together in the 1910s to create a national park movement. First and foremost was actually getting word out to the general public about the beauty and the importance of the Indiana Dunes. In 1913, Henry Chandler Coles actually hosted a group, the International Phytogeographic Excursion. Let me just tell you how long it took me to be able to say that without stopping. International Phytogeographic Excursion. And they stopped at several locations throughout the United States, one of them being the Indiana Dunes. Coles led this hike of internationally recognized ecologists, environmental scientists, botanists, that kind of thing, through the dunes, and helped, excuse me, bring more attention to the importance, scientific importance of the dunes. Excuse me. Okay. In addition to this, the Prairie Club and other organizations came together to create the National Dunes Park Association. The first mention of a Dunes National Park was in July of 1914, but there really wasn't anything done until 1916, July of 1916, when the National Dunes Park Association was formed. The very first president of the National Dunes Park Association was Armanus F. Knotts, who had been the mayor of Hammond. He was an attorney. He, oddly enough, was involved in a very interesting and very questionable horse racing track in the town of Porter, but that's also another story. Most of the people involved in the National Dunes Park Association were not in Porter County. They were not in the Michigan City area. They were Gary, they were East Chicago, they were Chicago, and that was the bulk of the people involved. On September 7, 1916, the U.S. Senate passed a resolution that paved the way for making the Indiana Dunes a national park. Ooh. The Secretary of the Interior was to investigate the land and the desirability of it for a park. And then October 1916, a public hearing was held in Chicago. excuse me, looking for people to state their views on the creation of a National Dunes Park. It was conducted by Stephen Mather, who was an honorary Prairie Club member, and he was also the assistant to the Secretary of the Interior. So this situation, by this point in 1916, early 1917, is like perfect. It's a perfect situation. A park should have been made. They had everything that they needed. Everyone at that October meeting spoke in favor of having a national park. Nobody spoke against it. Stephen Mather wrote a report. Well, let's face it, his assistants wrote a report to Congress recommending the establishment of a sand dunes national park in Indiana. It really should have happened, but there were so many things that were going to get in the way. Seeing how much momentum they had, the National Dunes Park Association formed a committee. It was the Dunes Pageant, the Dunes Pageant Association. And their goal was to put on a pageant, which is just an outdoor play, in the dunes on Memorial Day weekend and the weekend after in 1917. The Dunes Pageant was supposed to be interesting and dramatic, as well as historically accurate, or as accurate as it could be for 1917. And be the account of the different peoples who had lived in the dunes and of the political, social, and economic factors that had influenced their life in the dunes. It had widespread publicity in the newspapers and magazines, as well as a series of Save the Dunes posters and stamps. Ooh. It was called the Dunes Under 4 Flags. For any of you who don't know, there were actually 4 countries who claimed ownership of this land at some point in time: the French, the British, the Spanish, and the United States. The whole Spanish thing is a really interesting story. If you don't know anything about it, feel free to come visit me and I'll tell you. The association had given the pageant association $15,000 budget. $15,000 in 1917 was a lot of money. It would buy you a really nice house, like a really nice house. So they had pledged, people had pledged $15,000 to put on this pageant. Well, as you can imagine, if you think about the dates that this is happening, there was one really big problem. In April of 1917, the United States joined World War I. They declared war on Germany. So all of a sudden, we went from having this great momentum for a national park to put on the brakes because nobody cares about the national park system. They all care about the war. Their sons and fathers and brothers are going off to fight in the war. They don't want to worry about contributing to a park. They want to contribute to the war effort. So it really put quite a hitch in. We actually have a letter from one board member to the rest of the board members requesting that they postpone the pageant, but it was determined that the show must go on, and it did. They were expecting about 50,000 people each day of the 2-day pageant, which if I thought 400 people walking up a dune at once was bad, 50,000 would be wow. They had tents, they had concession stands, they had a temporary emergency hospital, they had guides for walks, they had information stands, police patrols, and a very special South Shore Express train set up just to bring people to the pageant. Tickets cost 50 cents, and the program, which you can see here on the right, cost 25 cents. It was a mixed bag, we'll say, this pageant. So the first day that it took place, Memorial Day, was kind of a flop because, you know, it's Mother Nature and it's Memorial Day, and so it rained. And they didn't get many people in on that first day, probably because of the weather. The next week, it was a beautiful day, and this picture that you see on the bottom left, that is a picture of the audience from the June 3rd pageant. Now, depending on which report you read, the total attendance for this was anywhere from 1,000 to 100,000 people. I did see one article that claimed 100,000 people attended. I don't think that's true. I think they're more likely under 10,000. Part of the reason I believe that is because they did not earn back their $15,000. So they actually, after the pageant was done and they looked at the, ledger and they saw how much money they still owed for it and didn't have, they went to the post office and just started writing letters to people requesting that they donate towards the Save the Dunes effort to help cover the cost of the pageant that had already been done. They did eventually break even, but it wasn't easy. The thing about that pageant is, like I said before, it should have gone off without a hitch. The park, there was never a better moment for that park to be created than in 1916, 1917. There was never a better point. Everyone who wanted to support it was supporting it. We had national support. We had Chicago support. The locals, Porter County, the Chesterton newspaper was really against it because they didn't want national bureaucrats in their backyard. But for the most part, there was strong support for it. But that situation with World War I just really put a stop to it. But even though the forward momentum for a national park ended, it did not mean that everything was out, because they had another option, and that option was a state park. The Indiana Dunes State Park was established, well, in March of 1923, the governor of Indiana signed a law, an act enabling there to be a Dunes State Park in Indiana. However, that bill did not give any money towards it. So it would take another 2 years before the Indiana General Assembly was able to pass another bill putting money towards land for a state park, which is why the state park did not actually open until 1926. But heading this effort to create a Dunes State Park was a woman named Bess Sheehan. You see her picture on the right there, Mrs. Frank J. Sheehan, which I won't get on my soapbox too much, but the whole Mrs. and then the husband's name thing drives me as a historian absolutely bonkers. It's the worst thing we ever did. Was call women by their husband's names. It's very confusing, but her name was Bess. And she is very, very, very important to the entire history of the Indiana Dunes parks, both national and state. She was involved in the first National Dunes Park Association. She was its secretary. She was a teacher before she got married. But in another Women's History Month thing, in many areas, women were not allowed to teach once they got married. In Chesterton, that was mostly the case because people felt that a married woman should not be taking a job away from a man who needed to support his family. But she was a teacher before she got married. Then she got married and she became what was called a club woman. So she was involved in the Indiana State Federation of Women's Clubs. And the thing about women at this time is that they were very limited in things that they were allowed to do in terms of occupation and things like that. But they understood the power that they really held in their hand. And she organized the women's clubs of Illinois and Indiana to fight for this state park. And they actually ended up having the whole United States Federation of Women's Clubs taking on this project in order to get this passed. Bess Sheehan personally visited, I'm going to say, the majority of the counties in Indiana to give programs on the history of the Indiana Dunes. She stood up in the Indiana General Assembly and talked to legislators about the Indiana Dunes and why it was important. When the governor signed the bill in 1923 establishing a Dunes State Park, he gave that pen to Bess. So I don't feel like I can overstate her importance to the entire system. The thing about the first national park movement, which turned into a state park movement, was that it had a very long legacy. You know, you had this generation of people that fought so hard for something. The next generation saw what was done and were able to pick up the torch of that effort. Oh, this is a picture of the early state park. This is probably in the 1930s. Well, it's definitely in the 1930s after the Dunes, the Pavilion and the Dunes Arcade Hotel were built. I love those cars, and I love how perfectly they're all parked. I wish people could park that perfectly now. But for the Prairie Club, the state park was established, but that did not mean the end of the Prairie Club. They actually sold their Indiana Dunes land to the state for $600 an acre for the park. In that sale, they made an agreement that from 1926 to 1932, Prairie Club members could still use their cabins that they had built on the beach. And the beach house would always be available to them and reserved for Prairie Club members only. So the state would not allow the Prairie Club beach house to be accessed by other groups or organizations. So in 1932, Memorial Day, this was kind of like a celebratory moment of the Prairie Club leaving the state park. The Prairie Club gave to the park the fountain that sits outside of the Nature Center today. It was designed by Jens Jensen, and it has that little snake head for a water fountain part. A little creepy if you ask me, but apparently very beautiful. So the next generations that come are coming in on the tail of this wildly, what should have been a wildly successful national park movement, which I would also like to emphasize was done completely by hand, by mail, maybe some phone calls, possibly if they had a phone, but mostly by mail. They were not able to send emails, no texts, no, internet advertising. This was all hand done. This was done by people who had a purpose and they knew how to get things done. Mostly women, I would like to emphasize. So by the time 1950 comes along, in 1949, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers did a study of the southern shore of Lake Michigan and gave a generally favorable report for the possibility of a deep water port in Indiana. This was very concerning to a lot of people. And in November of 1950, the Indiana Dunes Preservation Council formed with the sole purpose of opposing the development of the port at Burns Ditch. Burns Ditch had long been touted by state representatives as the perfect site for a deep water port. Questionable. I'm not a scientist. I'm not an engineer, so I really shouldn't comment on, but I kind of question the validity of that. But this was the first of the 1950s movements to really, they weren't pushing for a national park. They were just pushing for the protection of the dunes. Oftentimes they said, why don't we just annex this section of dunes into the state park? They weren't really saying, let's create a new national park. They were saying, let's make the state park bigger. And there were others who were also in favor of that. At this point in time, the state park was being lobbied to annex the Bailey Homestead into the state park so that the Bailey Homestead could be preserved and the Bailey Cemetery. But this group was specifically against the Burns Ditch, which is how much of the Save the Dunes Council started, was as a were opposed to the Burns Ditch Deepwater Port. So here you have Dorothy Buell on the right and Bess Sheehan on the left. Dorothy Buell, very well known. Bess Sheehan, I'm hoping that she's starting to become more well known for her role in the dunes. But this is where 1952 is the moment where like the two generations come together and the baton is passed for taking on the next role. Dorothy Buell had attended a meeting of the Indiana Dunes Preservation Council and was in favor of preserving the dunes and against the port. She invited Bess Sheehan to speak to a group of women at her home about the dunes and her experience with the dunes. That is the meeting where Save the Dunes Council began with, what was it, 21 women who attended that meeting and determined to save the dunes from this port. Bess Sheehan would continue to be very important to the Save the Dunes Council, particularly in 1953, when the Save the Dunes Council went to purchase Coles Bog in order to save it. And they paid $1,730 for Coles Bog, of which over $750 came from Bess Sheehan. Bess was pretty much the holdout of the National Dunes Park Association. Remember that organization started in 1916? She held the funds that still existed for the National Dunes Park Association. She donated those funds, those remaining funds, to the Save the Dunes Council for the purpose of buying Coles Bog. So that is that moment between the meeting in 1952 and the purchase in 1953 is the melding of the first national park movement and the second national park movement. The thing about the Save the Dunes Council is that it was so heavily run by women in its early years. Actually, in its very earliest years, they didn't actually start accepting men as members until a few years later. But it's also important to note that they knew that they were going to have to shift focus. At first, Save the Dunes Council focused on, they wanted to raise money to buy land to save it. It wasn't until a few years later that somebody told them, you're going to have to get political. Dorothy Buell did not want to get political. She didn't want to get involved in politics. She didn't think this was necessarily a thing that they could win politically. She wanted to win it by raising awareness, raising funds, and buying the land so that industries couldn't use the land. Well, she had a lot of very strong and very influential women by her side, one of whom is a woman named Florence Brody. I actually knew nothing about Florence prior to doing this portion of this program, and I find her absolutely fascinating. She was born and raised in Illinois. Her father was a district judge. He died when she was about 1. But according to things that I've read, she was absolutely influenced by his life. And as a child, she kept telling people that she was going to become a lawyer. Well, it wasn't impossible for women to become lawyers at that time. It just wasn't easy, necessarily. So she ended up going to the University of Wisconsin and getting her degree in journalism. And then she went to Gem City Business College in Quincy, Illinois, and became a stenographer. She ended up working as a stenographer for a political campaign in Illinois for Congress. And then she got a job working for the organization that was organizing the 1933 Century of Progress World's Fair. So she moved to Chicago in 1932 to work at that job. At the same time, she enrolled at the University of Chicago Law School. She graduated in 1934, passed the bar in 1935, and got a job with the Chicago Title and Trust. Now, I'm torn at exactly how this job worked out because I read one report that says her first job was actually as a secretary at Chicago Title and Trust, because they said, well, we need somebody who can, take notes and type and stuff like that. And she was a stenographer and she could do that. But that she was hired because she also had her law degree. But other reports say that the entire time she worked for them, she was a lawyer and she worked as a lawyer. And there's evidence in papers and law reviews and court cases that say she did practice law. I just don't know exactly how long she was a secretary or if she actually ever was a secretary at Chicago Title and Trust. But to me, that would be absolutely miserable to have your law degree and then be hired as a secretary. Not saying there's anything wrong with it. My mom was a secretary. God bless them. But Florence Brody ended up building her house in Ogden Dunes in the late 1930s, befriending all the women in the neighborhood, and was at the first Save the Dunes Council meeting and became an early member of Save the Dunes. She was an attorney, so she was not necessarily hired as their attorney. I'm not sure about the official status of that, but she obviously gave some kind of legal advice on certain things. She was experienced in the political field, having worked in a political campaign. And she was also active in several organizations in Chicago, so she knew a lot of people. She had worked in publicity for the campaign, so she knew how to market and publicize things. She ended up being one of the people who stood up with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and arguing with them over their findings for the practicality and logistics of a deep water port. And to me, I'm always a fan of people who like to argue about things. So she's one of those people that I feel like has not gotten the extensive attention that she necessarily deserves, because she was never president of Save the Dunes. She was never, she was on the board, I believe, but I can't remember as what. But she did a lot for Save the Dunes Council, and I never knew about her before this moment. But the women of Save the Dunes Council and the Save the Dunes Council in general, and the women of the National Dunes Park Association, had done so much for getting both the state and national parks built and established that I think it's underappreciated just how important club women were, because throughout history, there's this attitude towards club women. I say that with quotes, club women. But they were amazing and they were able to get things done, and they got things done relatively quickly, especially when you're dealing with a bureaucracy. But they could organize and they could get people behind them, so quickly and so ardently that they got what they needed to get done. Of course, the early Save the Dunes women led to the rising of other highly respected, wonderful women. I did not know Sylvia Troy or Ruth Osan. I did know Charlotte, and she was great. I loved talking to Charlotte. She had the greatest sense of humor, and she always came to my mystery readers groups. So I was always surprised to find out that she liked mystery novels. But as we go into Women's History Month, starting Friday, I think it is important to consider and look at the role of women in helping to save and helping to preserve the dunes that we have today. If you know anything about Westchester Public Library, which is what the museum is attached to, we are part of the library. Every Women's History Month since 2019, I do Facebook posts on the library Facebook page that celebrate local women and what they have done. Everything from housewives who had, gave birth to 13 kids, 2 of whom survived childhood, to people like Charlotte and Ruth and Sylvia. Florence is going to be, I think she's Monday's Facebook post, because I was fascinated by her. And I think it's important for people to understand just how impactful women have been in our history, even though the older history books really kind of left them completely out of the story altogether. But I'm sorry, I went longer than 45 minutes. It's hard for me to do this program in under an hour. It really is. But if you have any questions, I will take some questions. And if I can't get to your questions, you're welcome to contact me at this information.
Well, thank you. We'll start with a round of applause. Yeah. Does anyone have any questions? Sorry. So Serena, can you hear
Yeah.
me?
Yes, I can. I can hear you.
Okay. Yes,
Okay.
thank you. We had a question of what role did Sylvia Troy play in some of the early history?
Oh man, okay. Hold on, let me get all my notes because I don't want to get it wrong. She was president of Save the Dunes Council. She started the Calumet chapter of Save the Dunes Council in Lake County, Indiana. She was when in 1962, when Bethlehem Steel began building the mill here in Burns Harbor, she wrote that she called it terracide. So like Terricide. Terracide, we called it, the killing of land. Even as Congress was deliberating on a bill to preserve the very area, industry unleashed its bulldozers and leveled those magnificent dunes. She was in the early years in the 60s, she served as the assistant to Dorothy Buell. And she worked hard in getting support from labor unions. And, making sure that helping Dorothy get support from Senator Paul Douglas. As Dorothy Buell's husband started to have health issues in 1967, Sylvia became the council's new president. She didn't actually want to be the president of the whole Save the Dunes Council, but she ended up serving as the council president until 1976.
Okay, we've got one question here in the chat, Serena. It says, was there a point when the Prairie Club / Save the Dunes movement became more diverse? The early photographs look like it was mostly white organizers and participants.
Well, you are absolutely not wrong. I can't speak on when the Save the Dunes movement became more diverse. I can tell you that the Prairie Club movement was not. The Prairie Club still exists. Their camp is now in Harbert, Michigan. And their general demographic is no different than it was in 1917. If I had to make a comment on this, I would say that if you look at the state of race relations in Northwest Indiana in the 50s and 60s and even 70s and 80s and 90s and 2000s, people of color weren't necessarily in a social or financial position to support a Save the Dunes movement. I'm not saying they didn't. I'm just saying, as a general statement, I've studied the early racial dynamics in Northwest Indiana up until until the mid 1900s. And it was not nice. So I don't actually know when that would have happened. Probably, I would guess, more in the 70s, 80s, when the park was actually created. And when the National Lakeshore started looking at areas in Miller to save and protect, possibly. But that's pure speculation on my part.
anyone else have any questions here in the?
We just got a random one. How much was that concert thing, not the play?
Serena, can you repeat how much it was to attend the pageant in 1970?
So the tickets to the pageant were 50 cents each, and then the program that you got at the pageant was an extra 25 cents. And if I remember correctly, the special train from Chicago to attend the pageant was $1.
Yeah, that's pretty cheap. I mean, they really expected to raise $15,000 off of that.
Oh,
The other cost factor that I find really interesting is that the Prairie Club bought their property in the dunes in 1923 for $600 an acre. I mean, I realize it was 100 years ago, so you know, a lot changes in 100 years, but $600 an acre, that's crazy. And they had like 46 acres of land.
any other questions? I have a couple of comments that I'd like to add into this that kind of show a legacy of what Save the Dunes does based off of this presentation. Well, one, Save the Dunes is still a team of 6 women doing this
All
work.
right.
We are working extremely close with the national park, especially ongoing, including giving them some of our properties that have once been owned by Save the Dunes to expand this national park property, which is kind of the idea of what they originally wanted to do. So we are doing that, and this year we began partnering with the national park to sell passes to our Indiana Dunes National Park, with the proceed going to us. So it's a really nice collaboration we're doing. And then in terms of diversity and inclusion, that's one of our big goals at Save the Dunes is, you know, doing more work in Lake County, making sure that our programs are accessible and, you know, interesting. And, you know, all of us are doing a lot of work here to learn why those boundaries happened and are ongoing currently still in this area of why people of color don't necessarily have access and the privilege that white people do to access those spaces. So that's one of our really big goals here. Yeah. And then we also just had one more chat. That was someone who is John Reed, the oldest son of Herbert and Charlotte Reed. So he was joined us tonight as well. So thank you.
Just so you know, I mean, if you guys knew Herb and Charlotte Reed, like their family history is really fascinating. I did a Friends of Indiana Dunes way back Wednesday Facebook post about Herb's parents. And his grandfather. It's just, they're fascinating people. And the history, their family history in the dunes is amazing. Just saying.
Well, thank you so much, Serena, for joining us remotely. It was a great presentation. And
I'm so sorry I couldn't be there in person.
the presentation will be on our Facebook and our YouTube. So if you liked what you learned today and think you know someone who would love to learn this too, feel free to share those. And thank you all for attending tonight.
Thank you.
Thanks, Serena. We'll log off here.
All right, thanks.
Thank you.
Does association have anything to do with the Barker mansion and the Barker family?
So the people who built this house is the grandson of John Barker, who did the Barker mansion.
Does the Barker Welfare Fund donate or have anything to do